He rode through the rain, with the weight of the north on his shoulders, and not for the first time, Robb Stark felt like the world had grown colder since his father's death. The twins loomed ahead, grey stone and high towers, with the river slithering beneath. It didn't feel right. The air was too still, the sky too dark. But Robb had made peace with awkward welcomes. He'd broken a vow to the Freys. He'd married for love in a world that didn't care about love. Still, he was a king. Kings could mend broken alliances. Couldn't they? Talisa rode beside him, her smile soft, unaware of the storm building around them. She placed a hand over her growing belly. "Do you think they'll accept us?" she asked. Robb glanced ahead. "They have to. We're guests under their roof. They'll remember the old ways." Catelyn Stark didn't look as convinced. She watched the twins with narrowed eyes, her fingers tight around her reins. The silence of the approaching gates wasn't the kind of silence that came from peace. It was the kind that came from held breath, from words unsaid. Lord Walder Frey greeted them with his usual bitter humor and dead eyes. He had dozens of children, all standing like pale shadows in the hall. The stench of damp stone mixed with something else, something rotten beneath the perfumed air. "You've come," Walder said flatly, eyes dragging across Talisa like she was a stain. "Not quite the bride I expected. But I suppose beggars can't be choosers, can they?" Robb forced a smile. "Lord Frey, I owe you an apology." "Oh, you owe me far more than that, boy," Walder rasped. "But we're all family now, aren't we?" He turned and spat on the floor. "Come, let's marry your uncle to a girl he's never seen." Romantic, eh? The wedding was rushed, crude. Robb stood beside Talisa while Edmure nervously took the Frey girl's hand. The wine flowed, the music played, too loud, too cheerful. It felt like a performance. Every smile looked painted on. Every laugh sounded just a bit too sharp. Robb watched the hall, his warrior's instincts pricking with unease. But he pushed it aside. He had made peace. He had offered Edmure in his place, and the Freys had accepted. That was enough. His mother's voice broke through his thoughts later, quiet but urgent. "We shouldn't have come here," she said. "There's something wrong, Robb. They're too quiet." "Too polite," he sighed. "We're here to make peace, Mother. We insulted them. This is how we fix it. You think Walder Frey forgets insult with wine and a wedding? He's not a man of honor. He never was. And if we don't rebuild this alliance, we have no path south. We'll lose the war. The Lannisters will pick us off, castle by castle." Catelyn looked at him then, really looked. "Robb, when did we start fighting a war we couldn't win?" That night the feast dragged on. The doors were shut tight. The music grew more frantic, the laughter more hollow. Robb drank little. His mind was busy, thinking of Riverrun, of Winterfell, of his men still loyal in the field. He reached for Talisa's hand beneath the table. Her skin was warm, comforting. She smiled at him like he was still the boy who didn't carry the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. Then the music changed. It wasn't the kind of tune played for dancing or joy. It was a dirge, a northern song, the Rains of Castamere. Catelyn stood slowly. Her eyes darted across the room. She saw Rose Bolton, calm, calculating, sitting with a plate barely touched. She saw the guards along the walls, Frey men, not theirs, all armed, all watching. She moved behind Rose. "Your Grace," she said softly. Robb turned toward her. Her face was pale. Her voice trembled. "Why are they playing that song?" Roose Bolton looked up at her, his face unreadable. "The Lannisters send their regards." And then everything shattered. The hall erupted into chaos. Frey men drew crossbows from beneath cloaks. Arrows flew. Talisa gasped beside Robb, her dress blooming with red. She crumpled to the ground, eyes wide, mouth open but silent. Robb shouted, lunged for her, too late. The guards were on them. Northern men were being cut down where they sat. A blade sliced the air toward Catelyn, and she screamed. Somewhere a baby cried. Somewhere music still played. Robb dropped to his knees, cradling Talisa, his hands soaked in blood. His wife, his child, gone in an instant. He had ignored the warnings. He had trusted where he should have feared. And now death had come in the form of hospitality. The blood wouldn't stop. It soaked through Robb's tunic, through his hands, pooling around Talisa like ink spilled on parchment. Her breath had stopped, her eyes frozen wide with terror and pain. Robb couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was like time had stopped moving, but the screams shattered that illusion. He looked up, dazed, as chaos roared around him. Arrows hissed through the smoky air. Men he'd dined with hours ago now slumped lifeless at tables. Stark banners had fallen, trampled beneath boots and blood. He staggered to his feet, sword drawn, but it was pointless. There was no battlefield, no strategy, just a slaughter disguised as celebration. Robb, his mother's voice pierced through it all. Catelyn stood not far away, hair disheveled, blood smeared across her face. One hand gripped a knife she'd snatched from a fallen servant. The other held a young Frey girl hostage, the blade pressed hard against her throat. "Let him go!" she screamed at Walder Frey, who stood at the high table, smiling like he'd waited his whole miserable life for this moment. "You've had your revenge. Let him go, and I swear on the old gods and the new, she lives." Walder looked at her like she was an annoyance, nothing more. "I gave your boy bread and salt, and he repaid me with betrayal. You think I fear your oaths now, my lady?" Roose Bolton stood behind Robb now, his pale face calm as ever, untouched by the violence that surrounded them. He walked like a man taking a quiet stroll, not a man drenched in treachery. Robb turned, still clutching the hilt of his sword. "Roose, why?" he asked, voice hoarse. Bolton didn't flinch. "The North was lost, the day you put love before duty. The day you forgot what war demands." Robb took a step forward. "I trusted you. That was your first mistake." Then Roose drove the dagger into his heart. The pain was immediate, sharp, but almost unreal. Robb looked down at the blade buried deep in his chest, then up at Bolton's cold, steady eyes. "The Lannisters send their regards," Roose said again, softer this time, as if offering a final courtesy. Robb collapsed beside Talisa, his hand reaching toward hers but never finding it. He didn't feel the floor. He didn't hear the next screams. Everything went quiet inside him. Catelyn watched her son fall. Something inside her snapped then, like a string pulled too tight for too long. She screamed, high and raw, the kind of scream that cracks bone and soul alike. Then, without hesitation, she dragged the blade across the Frey girl's throat. The girl dropped like a rag doll, blood splattering across the floor. Catelyn stood there a moment, her face twisted in grief, her eyes hollow. And then, without ceremony, a Frey soldier stepped forward and sliced her throat open. She crumpled silently, like a tree cut at the root. The music stopped. The hall fell still, save for the dripping of blood and the crackle of torches. Walder Frey sat back in his chair, licking his fingers. "Clean this mess up," he muttered. Outside the twins, Grey Wind howled from his cage. The direwolf had smelled death long before the arrows flew. He'd snarled, clawed at the bars, but they wouldn't let him near Robb. The Freys were no fools. They feared the beast, just as they feared the North's anger. But not enough. A crossbowman approached the cage slowly, nervous. Grey Wind bared his teeth, a growl rising deep from his chest. The man hesitated, but orders were orders. He fired once, twice. The wolf jerked, yelped, then went still. In the camps outside, the killing continued. Northern soldiers, loyal men who had followed their king through fire and frost, were slaughtered in their tents. They never had a chance. No warnings, no honor, just betrayal and steel. By morning, the river ran dark with blood. Ravens flew, black wings slicing through gray skies, carrying news of death to every corner of the realm. And in the north, something ancient stirred. They had killed the king in the north, but they had awakened something far more dangerous. The news traveled faster than the crows themselves. By the time the ravens reached the Dreadfort, by the time the letters touched cold fingers and left ink stains on trembling hands, the North already knew. Robb Stark was dead. The young wolf, the boy who had raised the banners of Winterfell and struck fear into Lannister hearts, had been butchered at a wedding feast like cattle. His mother, Lady Catelyn, slain beside him. His direwolf, Grey Wind, pierced with arrows and beheaded. And still, no one in the North wept out loud. They didn't scream. They didn't riot. They didn't crumble. They waited. Deep in the wolf's wood, far from the stone halls of treachery, old men sat around fires and whispered the truth to younger ears. The Freys broke guest right. one said, voice coarse with age. Spilled blood under bread and salt. That's no kill, it's a curse. Roose Bolton helped them, another muttered, eyes gleaming. He put the knife in the boy's heart himself. I heard it from a man who watched the crows feast on the corpses outside the twins. The third man just stared into the fire. The gods will not forgive this. At White Harbour, Lord Wyman Manderley read the Raven's message with shaking hands. His sons had followed Robb. His banners had flown beside the direwolves. Now they were either butchered or scattered. His maester waited for a command, but the old lord said nothing for a long time. Finally he whispered, "They think the North will kneel now." He looked up slowly, eyes wet with something that wasn't sadness. "They're wrong." Even in Bear Island, far and isolated, the news struck like thunder. The Mormonts had always been loyal to House Stark. Lady Maige Mormont held the parchment in her scarred hands and handed it silently to her daughter Lyanna, only a girl, but already fierce beyond her years. Lyanna read it and clenched her jaw. They want us to forget him, like he never ruled, like his blood wasn't Stark blood. Her mother placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Then make sure they remember. But in the Dreadfort, the home of House Bolton, the walls were quiet and cold. Roose Bolton returned from the twins, not as a servant, but a warden of the North, appointed by the Lannisters themselves. His banners now flew alongside lions. He sat alone in the great hall one night, the fire casting long shadows across his pale face. He drank little, he ate less. There was no celebration, no music, just silence. Even his bastard son Ramsay, known for his sick humor and wild cruelty, had not yet returned from the flaying pits. Roose did not miss him. He stared at the high table, where once Robb Stark had sat with his bannermen and made Rose swear loyalty. The boy had thought honor would hold men in place. He hadn't realized that men like Rose served no house, no god, no king, only opportunity. And yet, for all his cold triumph, Roose Bolton felt something, an itch beneath his skin. The North was not cheering. The lords were not writing letters of allegiance. The people were not feasting. They were waiting, and in the shadows they whispered the same name, Stark. At Castle Black, Jon Snow stood atop the wall as the snow fell thick around him. He hadn't spoken much since the Raven arrived. Sam had read the letter, voice cracking, then stopped halfway through when Jon took it from him and finished it in silence. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, but something behind his eyes changed. Something dark and frozen settled in his chest. He'd watched his father die once already, watched Winterfell burn from afar, and now, his brother, his queen, his kin, all gone. "They want the North broken," Jon said that night, standing at the edge of the world. "But they've only made it colder." In the ruined halls of Winterfell, winds howled through empty corridors. Snow piled in corners where children once played. But the heart tree still stood in the godswood, red leaves whispering in the icy wind. Beneath its branches, the earth soaked with blood, both old and new, the land remembered. And so did the people. House Stark was broken, yes. But in the North, broken things do not stay down. They rise colder. They rise harsher. They rise with vengeance instead of mercy. The Red Wedding had ended a war, but it had birthed a reckoning. And soon the South would learn. The North remembers. The cold settled over the North like a shroud of silence. But silence in the North did not mean peace. It meant patience. It meant waiting for the storm to hit. The Red Wedding was not just murder. It was humiliation, treachery, an open wound carved into the very soul of the realm. And the wound bled day by day into the hearts of the people. Not every northerner had died at the twins. Some had escaped, wounded, hunted, grief-stricken, but alive. They returned with stories of how their king was butchered like a dog while the Freys laughed and feasted. Stories of how Roose Bolton stood among them and watched it happen. No shame, no hesitation. One such man, Sir Kyle of Last Hearth, limped into Barrowton with a shattered shoulder and an eye gone black from Frey fists. He didn't ask for shelter. He didn't ask for food. He asked for a pen and parchment. "I saw Robb Stark fall," he wrote, "but I did not see him break. He died with sword in hand beside his queen. Tell them that. Tell everyone That letter traveled through keep after keep, passed hand to hand like a relic of war. And with it grew the quiet fury. Not loud enough for the Lannisters to hear yet, but deep enough to last for generations. In the Frostfangs, far beyond the wall, another man read the news. He was no lord, no knight, just a man wearing the black of the Night's Watch. His name was Jon Snow, and though he had taken vows to hold no lands, bear no children, and wear no crown, his blood betrayed him. He was still a Stark in his bones. And when he read of Robb's death, something inside him cracked. He hadn't cried for Ned. He hadn't cried when Winterfell fell. But for Robb, his brother in name if not in birth, he mourned like a man who had lost the sun. He didn't speak of revenge. He didn't write angry letters. But those who watched him on the wall saw the change. His swordplay grew sharper, colder. He spoke less, smiled never. When Night Ghost, the albino direwolf, let out a low, mournful howl beneath the stars, the brothers of the Night's Watch heard it and fell silent, because even the wolves felt the loss. But while the North grieved in silence, the South celebrated. In King's Landing, Queen Cersei toasted the fall of the Wolf King with gold wine and cruel laughter. They named a boy king and expected him to win a war, she said, twirling her cup. Perhaps next time they'll crown a wolf pup and give him a sword. Tywin Lannister, however, did not laugh. He had orchestrated the Red Wedding, yes, pulled the strings from afar, promised Rose Bolton the Warden title, and gave the Freys their long-coveted pride. But he knew something the others didn't. This was not a victory, he told Tyrion in the council chamber. This was a warning to the realm, that treason ends in death. And what happens, Tyrion asked, when the realm decides to return the favor? Tywin didn't answer. In the Vale, Sansa Stark sat by a window, watching snow fall like tiny ghosts. She had not received the news, officially. But whispers travelled faster than truth. Servants talked in hushed voices, and Pater Baelish wore a strange, satisfied smirk for days. She knew. She felt it in her chest before she ever heard it in words. Robb was gone. Her mother, too. A part of her shattered that day, not with screaming, but with silence. She stopped asking to go home, stopped dreaming of Winterfell. The girl who had sewn wolf sigils into her sleeves began tearing them out thread by thread. She didn't cry, not then. But a flame lit behind her eyes that day. A cold flame, one that would burn slow but never go out. And in the north, in deep woods and snowbound villages, men and women began to speak names again. Names like Rickon, Bran, Jon, Arya. If Robb was gone, another Stark would rise. The Freys had butchered the king, but they had not butchered the bloodline. The Boltons had seized Winterfell, but they had not seized the North's memory. The North remembers, they whispered in the dark. Not as a slogan, not as a threat, as a promise. One that would grow with every passing winter night. One that would echo through the mountains and moors until it was no longer just a whisper, but a storm. Because in the end, the North is not ruled by swords or titles. It is ruled by vengeance, and vengeance was coming. The snow in the North was heavier that year. Some said it was the gods' mourning. Others said it was something worse, something darker, moving beneath the surface of the world. But whatever it was, it brought a silence that felt too thick to be natural. The kind of silence that came before bloodshed. Winterfell, once a proud seat of honor, now bore the flayed man of House Bolton. The walls that had echoed with the laughter of the Stark children were now cold, choked with ash and quiet footsteps. Servants kept their eyes low. No one spoke unless spoken to. And Rose Bolton ruled with a hand not of fire, but of ice, precise, sharp, and merciless. Yet even he could feel it. Something wasn't right. His soldiers were uneasy. Reports came in of loyalist pockets in the woods, small bands of Stark men refusing to bend the knee, refusing to forget. Caches of weapons were disappearing from old keeps. Frey patrols were found butchered in the snow, their skin flayed and hung from trees. It was starting, the revenge that no one claimed, but everyone feared. In Deepwood Motter, the Ironborn occupiers had begun to grow uneasy. They had held the castle for months, thinking the North broken, its leaders dead or scattered. But the woods around them whispered louder with each passing night. Figures moved between the trees. Traps were laid. Men vanished. One night a watchman screamed from the battlements. His body was found the next morning, headless, his tunic torn, a dire wolf's sigil carved into the stone behind him in blood. They thought the wolves were gone. They were wrong. Host Manderley, loyal to the Starks even in the shadow of death, began hosting quiet feasts, ostensibly for trade and diplomacy. But behind the walls of White Harbor, Lord Wyman was planning. Not rebellion, not openly. He smiled in front of Frey guests, toasted King Tommen's health, and bowed to Roose Bolton's new title. But every toast was a lie. Every feast was a test of loyalty, a quiet gathering of those who had not forgotten what was stolen from them. And one by one, those men began to ride south in secret, leaving behind not banners or declarations, but whispers and fire. In the hills near the neck, Howland Reed received the news of Robb's death late, but when he did, he stood by the old weirwood tree and said nothing for hours. His children, Jojen and Mira, watched their father in silence. They knew what it meant when Howland went still. He was remembering Ned, remembering promises, remembering the blood that tied the Reeds to the Starks. That night he spoke just one sentence: "We move at the heart's beat," and with that, the Crannogmen began to gather. Silent warriors, unheard and unseen, who knew the marshes better than any map. They would not forget the children of Winterfell. Farther north at the Wall, Jon Snow trained with his brothers, but his mind was far from Castle Black. The memory of Robb's murder haunted him like a ghost. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the twins. Not as he had ever known them, but as he imagined them, blood-stained, echoing with betrayal. His sword felt heavier, his vows tighter around his chest. Sam tried to speak to him, but Jon rarely answered. He was slipping into something darker. Because Jon understood now, the world didn't reward honor. It punished it. It punished Ned, it punished Robb, it punished Catelyn, and it had taught Jon one thing. If he was ever to do what was right, he would have to stop playing by the rules that killed his family. The Watch needed him, yes, but the North needed vengeance. Even in the Riverlands, Frey men began to die. Not on battlefields, in their beds, in their keeps, in their halls. A serving girl would disappear from the kitchen, and a day later, Lord Walder's nephew would be found with his throat slit. A stable boy would vanish, and a wedding party would be poisoned at supper. The Freys began to fear shadows. They locked doors. Doubled guards. They whispered of ghosts, of wolves, of a girl with a face that changed. Arya Stark was never seen, but the dead whispered her name. And Walder Frey, for all his gloating, began to sleep with a blade under his pillow. But even steel could not protect a man from the North's memory. Roose Bolton summoned his maester late one night, asking for more raven ink and extra parchment. "We will need to remind these houses who rules the North," he said, voice low and even. The maester, old and shivering, nodded. "Of course, my lord." But even he noticed the tremble in Rose's hand. Because Roose Bolton was not a man who feared battle. He feared vengeance. And vengeance had begun its long, cold walk home. The fire in the hearth crackled, but it did little to chase away the cold inside Winterfell. Roose Bolton sat alone in the great hall, staring into the flames, as if they might answer the question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Why had the North gone quiet? He had expected rebellion. Small uprisings, angry letters, perhaps a few stubborn lords refusing to pay taxes or raise banners. But there was nothing, and that terrified him more than open defiance. The North was not loyal to House Bolton. It never had been. They bowed because the Lannisters had placed a crown on his head. But respect, that could not be bought, and it would never be taken by force. Not after what he did. He had killed their king. And now every silence felt like a warning. In the woods north of the Dreadfort, scouts began to vanish. Not in groups, one by one. First a messenger, then a patrol captain, then 3 men on a supply run, all gone without trace. Sometimes a horse returned, sometimes not even that. One of the Frey commanders laughed it off. "Wolves, it's the wilds. Men freeze or wander, but the Boltons knew better." The bodies started turning up weeks later, always skinned, always nailed to trees, and always marked with a crude direwolf clawed into bark. At first, they blamed rebels, then wildlings, then the Ironborn. But soon the soldiers started whispering stories in their tents at night, about a faceless spirit that roamed the woods, about the return of Stark ghosts. They said the North was cursed. They said Robb Stark was watching. At White Harbour, Lord Wyman Manderley received a letter from House Karstark, sealed, unsigned, but unmistakably northern in its tone. He sits in our home, and still thinks he owns it. Wyman read the words aloud once, then burned the parchment. He didn't need names. He understood what was being asked. The Karstarks had once betrayed Robb for promises of vengeance, but even traitors understood now what the Boltons had truly done, burned the North's soul for a seat in the South's court. And now the tide had turned. On Bear Island, the women trained harder, sharpened more steel, lit more fires. "We fight for no usurper," Lady Mage Mormont declared before her hearth. "The North has no king, but it has a cause. And it bleeds stark." From Deepwood Motte to the last hearth, the message was the same. The Boltons wore a crown, but it sat on a broken throne. And in that brokenness, the North found unity. South of the Neck, one of Walder Frey's sons led 100 men on a tax route, collecting tribute for the Iron Throne. They never made it to White Harbour. The caravan vanished in the hills, swallowed by fog and trees. When riders were sent days later, they found wagons overturned, gold missing, every man slain, except for one. The survivor was tied to a tree, stripped bare, his chest carved with a single word. "Remember." He died before he could speak, but his body said enough. Ramsay Bolton returned to Winterfell late that season, laughing, dragging flayed bodies behind his horse like trophies. But Roose was not laughing. The hall was dim. The candles were fewer. The shadows seemed thicker. Roose looked at his bastard son with the coldest part of himself and said, "You play too loud." Ramsay grinned, dropping a severed hand on the floor. "They fear us." "No," Roose replied. "They wait." "And that is worse," Ramsay chuckled. "Then let them wait. I'll flay every last one of them if they even blink wrong." Rose stared at the flames again, thinking of Robb Stark's blood on his hands, thinking of how easy it had seemed that day, how final. And yet now, that blood felt like it had soaked into the stones of the North, calling to something older, something colder. "You can't flay the dead, Ramsay," Rose said quietly. For once, his son didn't laugh. In the Riverlands, Walder Frey sat in his hall, surrounded by sons and grandsons, smug in his ancient spite. But even he had begun to feel it. The quiet, the growing absence of safety, the way travelers looked at him differently, the way servants flinched when passing his throne. One morning, he found his cup filled with blackened wine and spilled it in disgust. No one claimed to have poured it. That same day, 3 guards were found hanged in the kitchens. He doubled the guard, but it did not stop the fear. It only made it grow. Walder Frey had orchestrated the greatest betrayal of the century, and now he knew what it felt like to be hunted. The North no longer needed armies to rebel. It had memory, it had silence, and it had a promise buried deep in its frozen heart. A Stark would return, maybe not Robb, maybe not Ned, but someone, anyone. And when that day came, every lie, every flayed man, every broken vow would be paid in blood. The sun never truly rose over Winterfell anymore. It merely loomed behind thick grey clouds, like a dying eye, casting a cold, colourless light over a stolen castle. Snow drifted through broken ramparts and collected in quiet corners of the keep. Even the walls groaned, as if they remembered who once ruled here and knew who shouldn't. Roose Bolton stood atop the battlements, surveying his prize. Winterfell, once the heart of the North. Now his, but it didn't feel like a victory anymore. He had sat the high seat for months, and still the North refused to kneel properly. No bannermen arrived with gifts. No feasts were offered in his honour. No northern songs filled the air, only silence and snow and the slow churn of fear. Roose was no fool. He understood the rules of power. He had broken the North's spine at the Twins, driven his dagger into Robb Stark's heart, flayed his way to Warden of the North. But you could not flay loyalty. You could not stab a memory. And the memory of the Starks lingered like smoke in a burned house. That memory was alive in the woods, where men loyal to no house gathered around hidden fires. Men who had once fought beside Robb Stark, who had lost brothers and fathers in the betrayal. They called themselves nothing. They raised no banners, but they remembered, and among them walked a girl with ash in her hair and steel in her heart. She had no name, not one she gave, but her eyes were sharp and always watching. She moved like a shadow and killed like a ghost. Only once did she speak. When an old man asked her who she was, she looked at him. Her voice cold as the wind. A girl remembers. Far away in the vale, Sansa Stark stood in a gown of blue and silver. Her hair dyed dark, her face a mask of forced serenity. Peter Baelish called her Elaine Stone, his bastard daughter, but even he could not shape the steel beneath her skin. He saw a pawn. What he failed to see was the slow awakening of a queen. When word of the Frey's latest murder reached the Vale, a cousin of Walder Frey found drowned with direwolf sigils carved into his chest, Sansa did not flinch. She only folded the parchment, tucked it into her sleeve, and whispered under her breath, "Good." She was learning the game, and she was learning what the North demanded now, not tears. Not mercy, vengeance. At the wall, Jon Snow trained harder than ever. The Watch took notice. His swordplay grew more brutal, his orders more precise. He wasn't just commanding. He was preparing for something no one else could see. And every night, Ghost sat beside him in the snow, unmoving, watching the horizon like he expected someone to come through it. Sam tried once more to break Jon's silence. "She was your sister," he said gently. "Catelyn. And Robb, he wasn't just your brother by name." Jon nodded, but his jaw clenched. "They died screaming," he said at last. "And the men who did it feast in my family's hall." Sam hesitated. "What will you do?" Jon didn't answer. He didn't have to. Back in the Riverlands, the Freys began to bleed faster. 3 towers burned to the ground. Dozens of guards vanished. A wedding party choked to death on wine, laced with bitter essence. No one could find who did it. No one even saw the killers, but the rumors grew. The girl with many faces. The wolf who walks as a shadow. The North's ghost. Even Walder Frey began to fear his food. He demanded tastings before every meal, doubled his guard, ordered executions for any servant who so much as whispered near his throne. Still, the deaths came, and on the stone floor of his hall, someone etched a phrase in blood that even his sons refused to scrub clean. The North remembers. And in the godswood of Winterfell, beneath the ancient heart tree, something stirred. The old red leaves whispered in the wind, and the snow seemed to fall more softly there. Crows gathered on the branches in silence. No one dared cut those trees, not even Roose, because deep down even the most ruthless man in the North knew, you don't touch the old gods. And maybe, just maybe, the gods were watching. The Boltons had claimed Winterfell with blood and treachery, but the trees remembered, the stones remembered, and soon the wolves would come home. The snowstorm came in the dead of night, thick and blinding. It blanketed the North in silence, covering the roads, the trees, the blood. But for those who had waited, who had watched, who had whispered, the storm was not feared, it was welcomed, because with the storm came the end. Winterfell's gates groaned as the wind slammed against them, icy flakes swirling through the cracks in the stone. The guards, Frey and Bolton men both, shivered at their posts, drawing cloaks tighter, peering into the dark. Something moved out there. Too quiet for horses, too vast for snow. Then the screaming started, not a war cry, not a horn, just screams. One by one, the outer guards were taken. Knives in the neck, throats slit clean, crossbows looted, fires doused. Shadows danced through the snow, like ghosts with vengeance in their veins. By the time the alarm was raised, it was already too late. Inside the great hall, Ramsay Bolton awoke to the sound of steel on stone. He sat up, shirtless, hair wild, eyes wide with confusion, until he heard the dogs howling from the kennels, not barking, screaming. Rose burst in moments later, dressed in black, pale as bone. "They've come," he said flatly. Ramsay blinked. "Who?" Rose stared at him. "The North. Outside, chaos unfolded. Northern loyalists in stolen armor opened the gates from within. Manderley soldiers stormed in through the snow, blades drawn, torches lit. Skagosi men, wild-eyed and silent, hacked through Frey shields like firewood. Women of Bear Island fired arrows from rooftops, precise and merciless. And among them all, cloaked in grey and red, leading them through the blizzard like a phantom, was a girl, small, swift, face hidden beneath a hood, blade in each hand. And every man who raised a weapon against her bled before he could blink. She didn't shout orders. She didn't need to. They followed her because she moved like Winterfell itself, because they knew. Arya Stark had come home. In the great hall the Boltons waited. Ramsay licked his lips, pacing. Rose stood still, quiet, calculating. "This isn't a siege," Rose muttered. "It's a reckoning," Ramsay sneered. "Let them come. I'll wear their skins before the sun rises." But outside, the banners fell. Not in flames, but replaced. The flayed man was torn down, and in its place, the dire wolf. The doors crashed open moments later. The fight was fast, brutal. Stark loyalists poured into the hall like a flood. Ramsay cut down 2 men before someone drove a spear through his thigh. He howled, tried to run, but found Arya standing in his path. She didn't speak, she just moved, and when it was over, Ramsay Bolton lay in a pool of his own blood, throat cut clean, eyes staring up at the girl he thought had died long ago. Rose, defiant to the end, was taken alive. Dragged to the Godswood in chains, there, beneath the weirwood tree, they gave him the same mercy he had given Robb Stark. None. By morning, the fires were out, and Winterfell stood free. The courtyard was crowded with survivors, soldiers, and small folk. Snow drifted through the broken walls, but no one cared. They looked to the tower where the banners flew, the dire wolf above all, and then the doors opened. Sansa stepped out first, her hair no longer dyed, her eyes hard but shining. She walked slowly, regal, no longer a girl but something far more powerful. Something made of both fire and frost. Behind her came Arya, silent, deadly, alive, and from the side, Jon Snow, summoned from the wall, returned not as a brother of the Watch, but as the last living son of Eddard Stark. He had not claimed it. He had not asked for it, but the people cried one word all the same: Stark! The wolves had returned. That night a new fire burned in the hearth of Winterfell. Bread and salt were served again at the high table, not as ritual, but as remembrance. A promise that the old ways lived once more. No flayed men, no southern crowns, just the north, whole, proud, fierce, and above it all, in the cold wind that howled through the towers. Something changed. The castle no longer felt haunted, it felt awake, far away. In the ruins of the twins, the last of Walder Frey's sons was found dead, eyes gouged, tongue cut, face peeled away. No one claimed it. No one needed to. On the wall, someone had carved it deep. Blood still drying beneath the words, "The North remembers." And this time, the whole realm listened, because the Starks had returned, and they had brought winter with them.